Andy, given your job title, you obviously knew this was coming, but it's still a shock, surely.
Well, it's certainly disappointing, as the Chinese government recently said. But I don't think it's a shock, unfortunately. From the Chinese perspective, the risk, the threat of the US taking these kinds of systemic retaliatory actions is a contingency that has been planned for, if not for years, if not decades. So it is a disappointment, but I would not say it's a surprise or even a shock.
We know that many Western countries are very suspicious of China's 5G technology. What are the security interests that the Americans will be thinking about when it comes to this executive order from President Biden?
Well, the way it's framed, and I think largely correctly, is that this is focused more narrowly on venture capital and private equity investments in technologies that the US sees as posing a national security risk. So it's important, I think, for our audience to recognize that this isn't as much about the money per se. China, of course, is awash in capital. But the value that these venture capital and private equity firms bring is not only their money, but the institutional knowledge of how to build successful companies in the technology space. So, in this way, this move by the Biden administration is understandable. That being said, I think, like the entire effort to squelch China's rise, is doomed to failure. In the short term, I think we will see some disruptions, but again, because this is not a surprise, I think China has anticipated this for years and has been developing measures to address this, that this will fail. The other reason I think it'll be very difficult to succeed is that capital is fungible. So this expertise is, of course, very valuable, provided by the expertise provided by venture capital private equity funds is very valuable, but capital is fungible. And China itself has developed a formidable alternative asset class infrastructure, meaning the professionals that invest in high tech startups. So there have been a number of successful Chinese venture capital and private equity firms that have accumulated decades of experience as well. So again, I think this is perhaps a desperate last ditch effort by the Biden administration to squelch China's rise.
How much do the Americans have to be careful of not affecting too negatively China's economy? Will this newest measure have that sort of effect? Because, of course, over the past few days, we've had China reporting deflation, which is not usual, also reporting some of its worst export figures for 2 or 3 years. So all those indicators, we've also got the overheated property sector in China. All those figures are indicating that China's economy is not growing as quickly as it should, and American action could also affect that, couldn't it?
It certainly can. So, of course, the China-U.S. Economic relationship, trade and investment, is very important to both countries. So, any moves that inhibit that relationship, of course, is not good for China. It's not good for the U.S. either. But in the larger scheme of things, clearly there are, I think, challenges that China is currently dealing with. Still, the legacy of COVID, other global challenges, and I think it's a question mark. Is China really experiencing quote unquote deflation? So certainly, some price measures have decreased. The analysis or the reports I've seen is that this is expected to be a blip. We, of course, don't know. We have to see. To look at it from perhaps a more glass half full perspective, what China is not experiencing is the very destructive inflation that countries around the world, including the United States, has suffered from over the last few years. So, how big a problem this is going forward, I think, remains to be seen. One important measure, I think one important aspect of this, I think it's important to mention too, is the government is focused on high quality growth and a transition to an economy driven more by technological advances and not just growth for growth's sake, which is why I think we're seeing a fairly measured response by the government so far to the latest economic figures. And the other thing I want to point out very briefly, too, is that the numbers we see in the West tend to be selectively chosen. So China's second quarter GDP grew by, I believe, like 5.3% year over year. But the number that was reported was the previous quarters, the second quarters compared to Q1, which is, I think, about 0.8%. However, when we're looking at pricing information, we're looking at year over year because that was a bigger drop than the one over the last quarter. So I would take these figures being bandied about in Western media with a grain of salt, perhaps.
Andy, thanks very much for sharing that expertise with us. Really appreciate it. Andy Mock in London.